Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, Episode 33B, an interview on Truman and the Bomb with D.M. Giangreco. I'm excited to welcome author D.M. Giangreco to the show today, and may I call you Dennis?
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. Dennis is an award-winning historian and expert on Truman, and he is the author of numerous books, including, most recently, Truman and the Bomb, The Untold Story, which will be published this month. Dennis, thank you so much for your time.
Well, it's just great to be here.
Your book and this episode are pretty well timed. Just this month, a major blockbuster called Oppenheimer was released about the Manhattan Project. Why don't we start there? What was the Manhattan Project, and why was it established?
Well, Kenny, before the war, Nazi scientists had split the uranium atom, which created nuclear fusion, which releases a staggering amount of energy. By 1941, it was clear that this could be harnessed and that bombs of tremendous power could be produced if the whole gamut of technical issues could be solved. It was also clear that Nazi Germany was far ahead of us in getting this done, and President Roosevelt authorized in June 1942 the secret Manhattan Project, the scientific and military undertaking to develop the atomic bomb.
So much of your book, Truman and the Bomb, is about myth-busting, and you write about a number of myths that have grown around Truman and the Manhattan Project. One of those myths, and this is one I saw put forward in my reading, was that Truman didn't know about the atomic bomb's development before he became president. So when it comes to Senator Truman and the bomb, what did he know and when did he know it?
Well, Truman and the Army officers assigned to his Senate Investigating Committee discussed the fissuring of the atom many times among themselves in 1942 and 43, and even touched on this matter as early as 1941. Now, that closed trio of Senator Truman, General Frank Lowe, and Colonel Harry Vaughan kept their lips zipped on the Manhattan Project, even as other committee members and staffers railed about government secrecy. One also finds in Truman's correspondence with his future Labor Secretary Schwellenbach that by July 1943, more than 2 years before Hiroshima, Truman knew that the secret project was what he very carefully described in the letter as, quote, a unique weapon whose explosion would be a wonder. Very careful wording there.
For sure. Do we have any sense of what his first thoughts of the bomb were?
Well, not really. Until it was pushed to the forefront of his attention after he became president, Truman really made only a few official efforts to examine peripheral aspects of the project. Land acquisitions, worker housing, and even those were made only when fellow senators began pounding at his door. Truman had made a promise to Secretary of War Henry Stimson not to press the issue, and he didn't.
So Truman, he's aware of the Manhattan Project, but he became responsible for it on April 12th, 1945, when President Roosevelt died and Vice President Truman was sworn in as president. In these first hectic days and weeks, how long did it take for the bomb to cross Truman's radar? What were the nature of those first conversations? Was it something that he was spending a lot of time and thought on?
Well, no time at all. Now, after the use of nuclear weapons against Japan, virtually everything related to the massive Manhattan Project became the subject of intense scrutiny and debate. But at this point in the war, it was not known if the secret project would indeed produce functioning atomic bombs, or even if such weapons would perform as expected. It was also unclear how the military junta controlling the imperial Japanese government would actually react to their use. It's important to remember that the first explosion of a nuclear device at the Trinity test site in New Mexico, in the New Mexico desert, was still more than 2 months away. Now, think of that if you go see the movie Oppenheimer. Anyway, while the Manhattan Project moved towards its questionable future, other highly secret and certainly more tangible top secret operations reached their respective peaks as the countdown to the invasion of Imperial Japan ground on. Beyond the Manhattan Project, there was Project Milepost, where reflagged American Liberty and other cargo ships flying the Soviet hammer and sickle from their masts were sailing right through Japanese straits to the Russian port of Vladivostok with supplies for the upcoming Soviet invasion of Manchuria, which Stalin had formally agreed to at the Yalta Conference. In addition to Milepost, there was Project Hula. Under Hula, which was both conceived of and formalized at Yalta, Russian sailors by the tens of thousands were passing in the opposite direction from the Project Milepost deliveries to Fort Randall, Cold Bay, Alaska, where they were secretly trained to operate the ultimately hundreds of American-made warships that were being turned over to the Soviets to support their coming war with Japan. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, you had the construction of prefabricated components for a massive artificial harbor to be assembled near Tokyo during the invasion of Japan. It was codenamed Iron Horse, and it carried a priority second only to the Manhattan Project for a structure that literally dwarfed the famous pair of artificial harbors at Normandy after D-Day. So there were other massive, though still essentially unknown today, projects associated with the planned invasion of Japan that were also in the works and were considered, frankly, far more tangible at the time than the unfinished and untested atomic bomb.
That is some great context. It's so easy to just assume like all of our secret eggs were in the secret Manhattan basket, but there were these other initiatives that we were also looking at. So Truman, he was sworn in on April 12th. He was briefed on the bomb. A couple weeks later, less than 4 months after that, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima under Truman's orders. Can you talk me through those 4 months? What were the big milestones or decision points that led Truman to drop the bomb?
Well, Truman had been president about 2 full weeks before he finally received a detailed formal briefing on the Manhattan Project, though he already knew far more than either his contemporaries then or scholars today would ever imagine through the efforts of his chief Truman Committee military liaison, General Frank Lowe. But it's important to make clear, as Truman historian Robert Farrell pointedly noted, Truman's prior knowledge of the atomic bomb's development had no impact at all on the actual decision to use it against Japan. For example, when President Truman wrote in mid-June 45 that he must soon make what he called the hardest decision of his presidency, that hardest decision had nothing at all to do with nuclear weapons, but with conventional strategy. Quote, shall we invade Japan proper, or shall we bomb and blockade? That's my hardest decision to date. While the reaction to the again not yet completed, let alone tested, atomic bomb by the Japanese militarists who controlled the government could not be known, the benefits of direct Soviet military observation could be predicted with a high degree of confidence if conducted in the full-blood manner that Stalin had promised. Now, after a rocky patch in U.S.-Soviet relations at the beginning of his presidency, Truman worked very carefully to ensure good relations with the Soviets. Getting the Red Army into the fight against Imperial Japan on the Asian mainland was really his top priority. He stated this over and over in explicit language and in writing to the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a group, and discussed it individually with at least two of them. Also the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, the Assistant Secretary of the War as well. Truman also discussed it with his Commerce Secretary, who preceded him as Vice President, and innumerable others, including, the White House Chief of Staff, the U.S. Ambassador to the Soviet Union, the former U.S. Ambassador to the Soviet Union, the Secretary of State, the Undersecretary of State, his, and previously Roosevelt's, emissary to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and his emissary to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He even personally broke the news to the Chinese foreign minister, and it was at the top of the list of his foreign policy objectives put together for the upcoming Potsdam Conference. Now, one might think that with such repeated specificity before, during, and after Potsdam on the part of the president, this would encourage historians to be they critics or defenders of Truman, to closely examine why he was focused so single-mindedly on, to quote Truman, getting from Russia all the assistance in the war that is possible. Instead, this objective is usually given, really only a cursory acknowledgement by historians before the focus shifts to areas more in line with the comfort zones of those interested in what's called atomic diplomacy and in the coming Cold War than the fundamental need to bring the current war to a victorious conclusion with the least possible cost in American lives. To a very real degree, however, historians have been only partially to blame on this matter, because Americans, allies, and enemies alike were kept in the dark on Projects Milepost and Hula, both of which secretly supplied massive amounts of U.S. aid in support of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. Unlike Lend-Lease shipments to support the Soviets in their battles against the Nazis, which were a very public affair, it was critical. It was critical that the buildup for their entry into the Pacific War be absolutely secret, because they currently had a non-aggression pact with Japan, and their lands in the Far East were extremely vulnerable to being cut off, even by a weakened Japan. In the immediate aftermath of the fighting, Milepost began to get some visibility, but with the Cold War quickly developing close on the heels of World War II, it almost immediately went back into the box. Neither the U.S. nor the Soviets, each for their own reasons, wanted to draw any attention to the degree of U.S. support to the Soviet combat operations against Japan. By the time that information began to be quietly released on this cooperation 10 years after the war, it literally wasn't even noticed. And naturally, when Americans think of the end game in the Pacific, the atomic bombs are always in the forefront.
As I understand it, Truman did not order the second bomb to be dropped on Nagasaki. Is that accurate? And if so, can you tell me what happened there and what the consequences were?
Well, not in terms of an order stating the city, stating that the city would be struck on a specific date and time, but Nagasaki was part of a 4-city target set that President Truman approved while at the Potsdam Conference. It, along with Kokura, Nagita, and Hiroshima, would be hit, quote, as soon as weather will permit, visual bombing after about 3 August 1945. Now, the bombs would be dropped as they became available, thus proving to the ruling Japanese militarists who maintained an iron grip on the government that the United States had more than one experimental bomb, which indeed was what they maintained until the Nagasaki blast made it plain to the Japanese militarists advising Emperor Hirohito were completely wrong. Between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hirohito's most senior military advisors had counseled emphatically against surrender and explained that the building of nuclear weapons was such a massive and expensive project that the bombs of that type could not be mass-produced and maintained, and that the United States would still be forced to invade Japan, where massive American casualties during the invasion would decide the issue in Japan's favor. But the destruction of Nagasaki changed all that. After the news of the Nagasaki blast was announced during a meeting of Japan's Supreme War Council, Prime Minister Suzuki flatly stated, the United States, instead of staging the invasion, will just keep on dropping atomic bombs.
One thing I read about this was that after the Nagasaki bomb was dropped, Truman changed the policy and said each bomb expressly needs my express permission for it to be dropped. Did you see anything like that?
Oh yeah. Basically, it was a matter of timing. They had to be spaced far. The idea had been to, as one of Marshall's subordinates put it, when they were looking into the idea of stopping strategic use and preserving them for tactical use during the invasion, which would have been fantastically destructive.
Holy smokes! Yeah,
but that we won't even get into that.
Okay.
But when that was being examined, it was brought up. Well, should we continue using them 1, 2, 3, 4? Because that's the idea. Use them as they became available.
Yeah.
The question as it developed was you wanted to have them. Instead of just dropping them 1, 2, 3, 4, you wanted to have some spacing in there. Give the Japanese leadership time to absorb what they were seeing. Space them out a little bit. And this way, you, in effect, give them time to react. Because at that particular point, they had not even officially reacted to Nagasaki. So, like a blast, say, the following day, although it actually would have been closer to a week, a blast, say, right away, might not have given them the chance to, have it really soak in.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that was that absolutely was discussed and ordered. There's a point at which you can be dropping them too fast.
Right, for sure.
As the whole idea at this point was a strategic use
Right.
against cities that had been spared strategic bombing,
Yeah.
and where the Japanese could see the damage, and where they could in effect be where the leadership could in effect be stampeded into an early surrender.
Yeah.
If you drop them too fast, you're potentially working against yourself.
Yeah, it's kind of like remembering what the purpose is. The purpose of the bomb isn't to kill people. They happen to kill people. The purpose of the bomb is to end the war, and so you need to space that when they're dropped
It
to
was
have that effect.
as noted by Marshall and Stimson and others. It was the shock
Right.
of the atomic bomb, which is what was we were aiming to achieve. These were strategic targets. Although after we didn't hear anything after the Nagasaki blast, there was the beginnings of an examination, the preliminaries to an examination on using them tactically. But I won't even get into that.
So there are very strong opinions out there over whether or not Truman should have used the bomb. And those opinions are sometimes informed by conflicting information about what Truman was being told, how reliable it was, and so forth. You address some of this when you write about the casualty projections around an invasion of mainland Japan. What's the myth and what's the reality around those projections and the influence they had on Truman's decision making?
Well, that's an interesting subject. The remarkably low casualty estimates for the invasion of Japan regularly cited by critics of President Truman were based on highly qualified and limited U.S. Army projections printed in a variety of briefing documents. Critics did not realize, because they didn't understand how the documents were created and used and what was their basis. Critics did not realize that these estimates derived from standard U.S. Army methodologies for creating such materials, usually represented only the initial 30 days and what was envisioned in 1945 as a series of campaigns on the Japanese mainland extending throughout 1946 and perhaps into 1947.
Wow.
In effect, it's as if someone during World War II
Yeah.
had come across casualty estimates for, say, the invasion of Sicily, and then declared that the numbers must represent losses from the entire Italian campaign.
Right.
And then, having gone that far, announced with complete certitude that the numbers actually depicted likely casualties for the balance of the war with Germany. Now, during the war, such a notion would be dismissed as laughably absurd and even bizarre. And the flow of battle would speedily move beyond the single event that the original estimates, be they good or bad, were for. Now, that, however, was in a long ago war, and revisionist historians doing much the same thing decades later have won awards and plaudits of their peers, received copious grants, and shaped the decisions of major institutions like the Smithsonian at the time of the Enola Gay exhibit, and most recently had a terribly flawed book transformed into a terribly flawed movie screenplay.
May I ask?
I mean, and continuing, it later turned out that President Truman's much derided account of massive casualties projected for the two-phase invasion of Japan were not, as his critics maintained, a, quote, post-war creation to justify dropping the atomic bombs. Far from fraudulent, these casualty estimates are richly supported by U.S. Army, White House, Selective Service, and War Department documents produced prior to the use of nuclear weapons against Japan and stretching all the way back through the last 9 months of the Roosevelt administration. Moreover, the casualty estimates were not secreted away in obscure Pentagon departments to be seen only by the eyes of anonymous junior officers. The high-level exchange between Truman and his most senior advisors after he received an estimate of 500,000 to 1 million American casualties,
Wow.
and the subsequent invasion conference at the White House it prompted clearly demonstrate this.
So Truman's sitting there, and his decision process is as many as 1 million American casualties, or I drop the bomb, kill maybe 100,000, 200,000 Japanese civilian casualties, and that's kind of, among other factors, one of the things he's weighing.
Yeah, see, it is not commonly understood today because the casualty figures one most readily picks up on World War II
Sure.
were at the time rather lowballed for a variety of reasons. And when you look at the full panoply of casualties from the war, most of which were suffered in battles against Nazi Germany, and over just a 1-year period. And I'll get into that in just a minute. They actually are running in through the level of about 1,200,000, and most of those were experienced in the European and North African theaters of operation, Mediterranean theater,
Sure.
and they include everything from psychological casualties, which were enormous, what they sometimes call combat fatigue, and disease.
Sure.
Like when you look at casualty figures officially stated, you're looking only at battle casualties, and it was really running more than double that. And of course, that all affects selective service. It affects, keeping units properly manned in the field. It was a pretty grim situation that was being faced at the time.
What was national reaction to the bomb being dropped on Japan, and what was global reaction?
Oh, global reaction. Well, of course, that ran the whole gamut. For an individual, some degree of wonderment mixed with a tinge of fear, perhaps, before they got on with their daily lives. For Americans, though, especially if you were one of the 5 million men slated to take part in the invasion of Japan, it was a feeling of immense relief, salvation. You got to remember, the United States had been at war not even full 4 years as yet, entering World War II late when compared to other nations, and with no invading armies rampaging across its soil, it had not even begun to suffer the huge day-in, day-out losses common to the other combatants until just the previous summer. But then it was hit, and it was hit hard, real hard. Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, and Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands, marked the beginning of what the U.S. Army termed the casualty surge. In post-war analyses, a year-long bloodletting that saw a monthly average of 65,000
Wow.
battle casualties among young American soldiers and Army airmen from June 1944 to May 1945. And these figures did not include the considerable Army losses due to sickness and disease,
Wow.
which pretty much paralleled combat losses,
Yeah.
or the appalling Marine and Navy casualties in the Pacific. The number of just Army dead, wounded, injured, and missing reached its peak during the months of November and December 44 and January 45 at 72,000,
Wow.
88,000,
Whoa.
and 79,000, respectively. In January 1945, Secretary of War Stimson held a press conference to announce that the Army's monthly selective service call-up, which had already been increased from 60,000 to 80,000, and again, that's monthly,
Yeah.
just been announced weeks earlier, but now he announced that it was to be ratcheted up in March to 100,000 men per month. The total draft calls actually climbed to 140,000
Wow.
per month when the Navy and Marine calls, are added. A week later, President Roosevelt, Army Chief of Staff Marshal, and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral King outlined the military's critical manpower needs to Congress for what was soon to be a one-front war against Japan. And the public was informed by front-page articles in the New York Times and other papers and Time magazine that, quote, the Army must provide 600,000 replacements for overseas casualties
Wow.
before June 30th, and together with the Navy will require 900,000 inductions by June 30. Now, those publicly released numbers are absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And are essentially invisible today. You certainly won't see them in the Oppenheimer film. That summer, however, at a meeting of the Maryland Historical Society after the defeat of Germany, Marshall, who'd already lost one son in the Italian campaign, remarked, the full impact of the war comes more to me, I think, in some respects, than it does to anyone in the country. The daily casualty lists are mine.
Yeah.
They arrive in a constant stream, a swelling stream, and I can't get away from them. You know, if you title this podcast, you ought to use that as the title. Anyway, as far as Americans from Waukegan to Washington were concerned, we weren't at the end of the war with the defeat of Nazi Germany.
Right.
We had only just reached the middle of it.
Yeah. Now, that's all fantastic context, and I can only imagine how horrifying it would have been to see those numbers, you know, when you're at home in the kitchen, you have a loved one who could be drafted. That must have been a tremendously shocking experience. Today, you know, you see a lot of people.
Well, one thing I will add real quickly is at that point in time, many daily newspapers were printing local casualty, printing the local casualties that had been released. Basically, it's about a 3-month lag time, but local casualties were being printed in daily newspapers at that point. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go on.
No, I appreciate that. Now, today, as you mentioned, a lot of that context is lost, and today, a lot of people respond to the use of the bomb with absolute horror. When did opinions on Truman's use of the bomb start to change?
Well, As early as 1981, Pacific veteran Paul Fussell famously wrote, quote, "The degree to which Americans register shock and extraordinary shame about the Hiroshima bomb correlates closely with lack of information about the war." UN figures compiled after the war in the Pacific and China demonstrate that hundreds of thousands, mostly civilians under Japanese control from Indonesia through China, were dying each and every month the war continued, principally due to starvation, disease, and exposure. As for Japan, U.S. estimates were that we might have to kill 5 to 10 million Japanese before the war was over, and the suicidal fanatics in control of Japanese decision making. Their closest modern parallel to them would be, say, ISIS in the Middle East, calculated and were content in the belief that the nation would survive even if 20 million, a fifth of all Japanese, were to die. Or as it was put at the time, to die together gloriously as a nation, the shattering of 100 million like a beautiful jewel. Jeez. Oh, well, anyway, today...
you read some of the writings and you're like, these guys are crazy. Holy smokes.
Well, today, fully 4 decades after Fussell's comments, and more than 75 years after Hiroshima, World War II, you got to remember, is not even a dim memory for most Americans. And the numbers killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki versus the vast numbers saved if the war had continued as expected are just abstract figures with long strings of zeros. And about the easiest thing that someone who knows little or nothing about the war in that era can do is focus on the well-known bombing of 2 cities in a single nation instead of the millions who were right then far from American eyes, dying under the brutal Japanese occupation that stretched in a giant arc from today's Indonesia through Southwest Asia and China.
Now, did Truman ever express remorse or misgivings about using the bomb?
No, not a bit.
Are there any other common misconceptions or myths around the bomb that you want to call out and set straight?
Oh, on the bomb itself, really no. But the extreme secrecy surrounding the ultimately successful effort by Roosevelt and Truman to get the Soviets into the war against Japan did open the way for some very basic misconceptions to become well established on why the atomic bombs were used. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been regularly portrayed as being militarily unnecessary, that they were really intended to intimidate the Russians, and that there was a supposed race by Truman to drop atomic bombs on Japan before Stalin could enter the Pacific War. This is completely imaginary. Both the Roosevelt and Truman administrations believed that Stalin's entry into the war against Japan was in the interest of the United States, and they went to great lengths to ensure that end, which included both political guarantees and a vast quantity of supplies specifically tailored to support military operations against Imperial Japan. The idea was to save American lives and achieve victory in the war quickly, if possible. As the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averell Harriman, noted at the time, his instructions were, quote, not only to obtain Russian participation, but also to have them give us the right kind of help and enough time to prepare to make their help effective. And that's exactly what the Soviets did. Today, the atomic bombs on the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by the immediate surrender of Japan, continues to overshadow the Soviet declaration of war, which 2 American presidents labored hard to get.
Yeah.
But this does not negate the fact that the United States fully accepted the political gains in the Far East that Stalin had sought at Yalta and were locked in at Potsdam. After the war, the results of those 2 conferences increasingly became a matter of grave concern to many Americans, and little to no effort was made by either the U.S. Armed Services, the State Department, or the Truman administration as a whole in the developing Cold War environment to publicize the extent of direct U.S. aid in support of Soviet military operations against their old Japanese enemy. And one fundamentally important point struck me only recently. It's the fact that the U.S. keeping mum on this matter is in itself what opened the door to all of the later nonsense that was spread regarding Truman and the end game in the Pacific. A void was created, and you know the rest. The ramifications have been far-reaching, negatively influencing scholarly opinion and public perceptions, and ultimately how we view ourselves as a nation. And I think I've gone over the allotted time, but you see what I'm getting at here.
I'd love to ask you one more question that I know my listeners would want to hear your answer on. I think we all probably suspect what it's going to be, but do you think Truman was right to drop the bomb?
Well, there's going to be all kinds of dancing that people can do on the moral question, but it's like I said, the UN figures were very clear. Depending on how you constructed the UN's own figures after the war. I forget the name of. They had two specific organizations involved in studying the aftermath of the war there, and the impact of the war on the populations. And when you put them all together, again, I've used the word earlier, mind-boggling. But again, it's got to come up again, mind-boggling. There's between 300,000 to 400,000 people dying every month. You think of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but in March, the firebombing of the eastern districts of Tokyo ended up incinerating or asphyxiating 100,000 Japanese in the Japanese prefecture of Okinawa, because you could really say that we had already started the invasion of Japan with the invasion of Okinawa. It was a prefecture of the country, like a state in the United States. Anyway, as the fighting rolled through that island, there was certainly no fewer than 35,000 Okinawans killed. Definitely no fewer than 35,000. And some figures have that stretching, again, up to that 100,000 figure. Then there was the couple-month-long battle for Manila, which was also, that had also taken place, where the Japanese that were being ordered to put down their arms or to not fight for the city by their senior leadership fought anyway. And again, the Philippine government has very, very specific and hard to read statistics on this. Again, you've got another 100,000 people there, essentially to Japanese mass killings in groups of several dozen up in through the upper hundreds occurring during the brutal fighting. And finally, in its last week or so, American artillery as well. So there you've got Okinawa.
Yeah,
You've
yeah.
got Manila, you've got Tokyo, and
You've
these
got a
are
lot of
just
data points.
these are just events that you can easily point to.
Yeah,
You're getting in the realm of 250,000 just there.
yeah,
So the level of mass death
yeah,
in the Far East
yeah.
was occurring at staggering proportions. This is not, to put it mildly, well understood today.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We're so detached from that time.
Now there is a somewhat more knowledge in Europe of Europe because
Sure.
we are the histories have frankly been fairly
Yes,
Eurocentric.
absolutely. Yes.
You know about the Holocaust. You
Right.
know about the aerial bombings. On Germany.
Hmm.
There's some knowledge, especially in Germany itself, about the roughly 2 million Germans that died in the
Yeah.
last months of the war,
Hmm.
as the fighting rolled over them, and as they were expelled and on the road without food from
Mm.
portions of principally of Poland. That amounted to another couple million. There's considerably more knowledge of the mass death in Europe
Yeah.
than there is of the mass death in the Far East.
And can you tell me? We talked about. You alluded to this earlier. The bomb, the second one in Nagasaki, the impact that had on a war minister meeting that was happening in like Japan at that time. What does the evidence say? What does the proof say? What does the record say about the impact that second bomb had in ending the war? Like, can we point to it and say Nagasaki that did end the war?
Well, as a matter of fact, although he passed away later, it's too bad you didn't put that question to Sadao Asada, who a number of my colleagues know, but like Americans as a whole know very little about. But he was like arguably the premier authority on on decision making
Oh,
within the Supreme War Council, and he wrote an award-winning article on that. And yeah, it's very specific. And they can look up the name Sadao Asada
hmm,
and find his writings. And yeah, it's a lot of materials that were not available immediately after the war
hmm.
became available after two events.
Okay,
The death of Hirohito,
sure.
which like
Yeah,
really opened the floodgates on the other side of the Pacific,
yeah.
and on this side of the Pacific, spurred by the disastrous Enola Gay exhibit at the
Huh.
the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Uh, but a lot of the materials were available, but they really came to the forefront, at
Yeah,
least among scholars,
yeah.
after those two events.
And so would you say that material does show Japan like here Nagasaki was the cause that they ended the war, or was like 90% of why they ended the war
It
when they
was
did?
as far as the mind of the person who could
Yeah,
declare it over, Hirohito,
yeah,
yes.
yeah,
But the thing is even then it was a very dicey situation. Even after,
yeah.
you mentioned the absolute fanaticism
Yes,
of the ruling military junta.
yeah,
It is important to note that even after the Hiroshima blast and the Nagasaki blast and the Soviet entry into
Right. War.
the war in the Pacific, the ruling military, the top military people, were still intent on keeping the war going. And these are the guys in control. I mean, the emperor had to really push to get an agreement to, like, pull things back and surrender. And even then, a coup by mid-level officers in Tokyo killed senior Japanese military people and civilian leaders in the last moments of the war, as there was an effort to try to locate and take the emperor, into custody for his protection. You understand?
Right. Of course.
And also to confiscate and destroy the recorded surrender announcement, the famous surrender announcement that was to be broadcast the very next day. Now, ultimately, that coup failed after numerous deaths, and its leaders, committed, suicide.
Right.
But this was a very dicey thing. The war didn't even immediately end, even after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet declaration of war. This was a very close-run thing.
Yeah.
And it's for this reason that planning for the invasion actually continued even after the atomic bombs were dropped. There was no guarantee that there was... I mean, if you look at things now, it all, appears that everything advanced, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in this perfectly orchestrated, culmination to the war. But this was a very close run thing. That's another aspect of the war that is not fully appreciated.
And to underline the extremism in parts of the Japanese military, there were some soldiers still fighting in the 60s or the 70s, if I remember. Like the last Japanese World War II soldier to surrender is something like almost 30 years after the war ends.
Yep, that's right. Yep, that's exactly right.
Dennis, I've really enjoyed this interview. Listeners, if you've enjoyed this interview with Dennis and want to learn more about Truman and the bomb, please pick up Dennis's new book, Truman and the Bomb, The Untold Story. Or you may also enjoy his other book on the end of the war, Hell to Pay, Operation Downfall and the Invasion of Japan, 1945 to 47. Or if you want more on Truman, Dennis has got you covered there too. The Soldier from Independence, a military biography of Harry Truman. Thank you for your time, Dennis.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and write a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. You can also follow the show on Twitter at APH Podcast or on Threads, Kenny.Ryan27. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. It helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, we all know Truman got his start in politics with help from the Pendergast machine. But who were the Pendergasts? What were they involved in? And how much influence did they really have on Harry S. Truman? That's coming up next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.